Right. Let's begin. Few things I want to just talk about before I begin. This session is on aggressive characterization, which means how do you strategically use characterization within your speeches in order to further advance your case. What this looks like is not just me talking about what characterization is. This is going to be a slightly more advanced workshop. So I'm going to assume you already know what characterization is and how do you usually deliver characterization. This is going to be more around what is the best way to deliver that characterization, how to use it strategically in the way that it makes your arguments the most optimal, and also why and when you should use a characterization and what questions you should ask yourself while having this characterization. Let's move forward. The First, yeah, I'm going to talk about a few things within this workshop. One, why do we characterize in the first place? I've seen a lot of teams, and the problem they have is that they have characterization within their speeches, but that characterization gets nowhere. And that is where the strategy aspect of it comes, right? Every time you're giving a speech, you need to ask yourself the question, why am I saying this particular sentence? If I only have 7 minutes and I have only limited time to prove what I want, I need to question every single sentence and the impact of that sentence within winning my case. So the first question you need to ask yourself is why do we characterize? What value will it play within my speech? What will change if I give this characterization within the debate, and how that will lead to me getting a first within this debate. The second thing is characterization and framing. These two things often go hand in hand, and therefore I'd like to talk about both of them. I won't spend too much time on framing, but you do need to understand A, what the difference is, and two, how you can use both of them together to compound the effect of what you're talking about. Third, and this is one of the most important things, characterization is argumentation, which is to say, characterization has impacts, characterization has analysis, characterization has a counterfactual and comparative. Therefore, whenever you're going ahead and delivering characterization, it's not enough to just give a couple of sentences talking about why stakeholders are behaving this way or why this is the characterization you want to push in the debate. You have to argue about things like why is this likely? How much of a big impact does this characterization have within this debate? And this is something I'll be talking about again and again within this workshop. And the last thing is aggressive characterization, which will be the crux of this workshop and where we'll be taking examples as well. It's not enough to just characterize. It's important to characterize in such a manner that it wins you the debate, that it is the winning part of your debate and it's the most convincing thing you will speak. Because if you do that, a lot of your other argumentation will become much more easier and much more obvious. We'll talk more about this later. Any questions till now? Before I go forward, any questions on characterization in general? Like, what is characterization? Do you want me to go over the basics for a couple of minutes?
I have one doubt.
Hmm.
What exactly is the difference between framing and characterization?
I'll come to that within the section. Anything else? Cool. Let's start. Question one: why do we characterize them? Why is this going back? Yes. Two things you should care about before I even get into why we characterize it. Whenever you're going ahead and thinking about characterization the prep time, there should be two things you should be thinking about. And these are the questions you should constantly be asking yourself. One, should I give this piece of characterization? That is it important to give characterization at this step? Second, if I give characterization, what should I include within the aspect of that characterization that will make me win this argument or make my clash sound much better within the debate? Right? The way you want to go ahead and think about this is one, should you be giving characterization at any point of time? Is what value it is going to add? Is it going to make your argument sound much more believable? The stakeholders that you've identified, are their actions right now confusing and complex to an adjudicator? And therefore, giving characterization will make it much more obvious what your case is about and how these actors are likely to behave in the situation that that the motion puts them in. All of these questions, if the answer is yes, then you obviously want to go ahead and give this characterization. Number two, you can characterize a lot of things. You can give clarity about 15 things. When you look at a motion, you have 15 different things that are going on within the motion and multiple stakeholders. You need to ask yourselves which one are the important stakeholders and do they need to be given clarity within this debate. Only if it's necessary or is likely to win you the debate, you want to focus on it. You don't want to focus on random characterizations that are not going to change anything. Um, let's take a motion. Yeah, one thing quickly. Can you guys give more motions? For example, put motions in the chat, something against characterization you have struggled on, and we can practice those as well, since it will be much more helpful. I see one. This house opposes the stigma against hypocrisy. So let's talk about this, right? What do you guys think should be characterized here, and why should it be characterized? Let's assume we are government in this house opposes the stigma against hypocrisy. Think, imagine you're in prep time and think about these questions. What should you give characterization about? Which words in this
In
mo-
one way, we could characterize it by proving who are the stakeholders who exactly practice this hypocrisy and what is their incentive to do so. Why is it so important for them?
Excellent. What else? Someone raised their hand. They can go. You guys can unmute. You don't have to raise your hands.
Maybe we can talk about the specific cases in which hypocrisy is allowed, like obviously not in like judiciary courts and stuff like that, but the extent or impact it has.
What else?
Uh, I think we will start at explaining exactly what this stigma against hypocrisy looks like as a narrative for the people, how you interpret it, what are the words and instances that
Excellent.
compose it.
Excellent. What else? Okay, fundamentally, just reading the motion, two words stand out to me, right? Stigma and hypocrisy. So you need to characterize these words. One, in terms of what stigma looks like, which is what Maninder talked about, in terms of where the stigma exists and how it is actually impacting people, i.e., a stigma exists on a lot of things, but some stigmas are much more powerful than other stigmas. How does this stigma impact the lives of regular people, how it shapes them to behave, is important characterization, because you can't prove that a stigma is bad and therefore we should oppose it if the stigma does not have a lot of powerful value within society. That is to say, if opposition can prove this is a very tiny stigma and it does not impact the way in people work, there is no point in opposing it because you're not changing much within the debate. That is fine. Like that is a case that they can run. Therefore, as government, it's important if we want to win the debate to show that the extent of our harm is massive. And we can only do that if we're able to show clarity in why this stigma is so bad to people. That is number one. Second one is hypocrisy itself, right? You also have to characterize hypocrisy. So Rushil hints at this, but this never comes through really in all of your answers. Is we don't haven't explained what kind of hypocrisy has stigma and what kind of hypocrisy doesn't have stigma. It's not like every single hypocrisy uniquely has the same amount of stigma, right? Some of them are much more punished, some of them are much lesser punished. So what this hypocrisy looks like, how actively it is punished on the basis of that, are things that we can characterize. And explaining this is incredibly important in winning the debate, because once again, if you're not able to show that this hypocrisy is something that is massively stigmatized, and which specific hypocrisy is the biggest victim of all of these things, then there's no way in which you can go ahead and win this debate. Yeah, Rushil, I see your hand up.
Sorry, I just forgot to lower my hand. Just forgot to lower my hand.
Sure. Does anyone else have any questions? Cool. The I think this should give you an idea on why should I give characterization. You're giving characterization because things like stigma and hypocrisy are relatively unexplained at the start of the debate. If you don't explain them and give them the clarity about why these are bad things or why these are good things, you won't be able to explain much deeper about why this is a massive problem that you need to solve. At the end of the day, your impacts will not be large if you have not characterized why the stigma is so offensive or so bad within society. Therefore, all the way in your argumentation at the end, when you're impacting and weighing your speech, that needs to have, like, if your speech hasn't had enough characterization, your end impact suffer. So your starting needs to be especially good to paint the problem in order to show that the problem you're solving is also a massively important one. That is the power of characterization. It affects the entire impact you have within the debate. Cool. Second question you need to ask yourself is, how do I give characterization? Note, when you're talking about characterization, there's multiple things you can explain within that. For example, how this permeates throughout society, how impactful it is, what kind of people it's hurting the most. All of these questions need to be asked with the lens of, again, is this going to advance my argumentation? Is this going to win me the debate? For example, within hypocrisy, you can talk about multiple types of hypocrisy. There can be hypocrisy in terms of politicians when they talk about one thing in their campaign promises, but then do things that are exactly opposite or fail to deliver on campaign promises. You can talk about it in terms of people claiming that they are fundamentally opposed to something because other people are doing it while doing it themselves in the background through societal things. So, for example, people who go ahead and vocally, you see this sometimes, like people who are vocally like against the LGBTQ movement, but are also have been caught on camera performing like performing these acts or being gay themselves. These are important things to note because the kind of hypocrisy you're talking about is incredibly important. Because if you talk about minor hypocrisies that nobody's going to take care about, for example cheating on a small test, then it won't change the debate, because the harm you're trying to push or the harm you're trying to solve is not massive in its extent. It's unclear why the problem you're solving needs to be cared about. Therefore, you need to actively choose within your characterization what you're trying to characterize. And if you're characterizing that particular thing, is it massively impactful within the debate? Is it going to change my end impact? Therefore, whenever you ask yourself questions about characterization, ask yourself, the impact I gave at the end of my argument, is that going to change by the basis of the characterization that I have already given? Let's move forward. Why do we characterize then? Three things. One, we like winning. Characterization is often the difference between winning and losing a round. And this is because I feel, not I feel, a lot of debaters, once they have crossed a certain threshold, are able to analyze arguments. You already know all the basic arguments, you know how they run, you've practiced them enough, and everyone has relatively the same arguments within their head, which means reasoning your argumentation is not the most important thing within the debate anymore, since everyone is able to do it. What gives you the edge is explaining why it is so likely that the argument you have delivered is the correct argumentation or is the most likely argumentation as opposed to other teams. Because you have similar levels of argumentative levels, because you all know the same arguments, it becomes much more important in proving why your argumentation is much more important, why the stakeholders you're going to talk about are much more likely to behave in the manner that you have spoken about rather than the way in which the other team has spoken about. Because characterization improves the likelihood of you being much more obvious within the debate, or your argument becoming much more important within the debate, or the people you like, the stakeholders you talk about, acting in manners that you have identified are the most important thing in the debate. Characterization becomes a lot more powerful. Cool. Are there any questions till now? Cool. Let's move to the second point. Yeah, Rushil.
Suppose you're op and like Gov makes a characterization you don't agree with or you feel like squirrels your case, right? Do you immediately call it out via POI, adjust it at the start of your speech, or like make a parallel case and then wait at the end?
So the first two are fine, right? If they take a POI, you can do it. The problem is you only have 10 seconds to ask a POI, so it's really difficult to counter characterize in 10 seconds. Usually you want to call it out at the top of your next speech. But for example, if closing government is recharacterizing in a way that's squirrely and you're opening opposition, you have no objective but to POI. You just don't want to bring it at the end of your speech because, again, characterization is usually given at the starting because it sets the context within the debate. If you're setting up that context, it becomes a lot more clearer why you're doing this or like what the rest of your case is going to be. I talked about how characterization necessarily shapes your impacts. So if you give your impacts but they're not shaped by a characterization and the characterization comes later, it's not going to be something that's incredibly helpful. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Also, everyone, I'm going to take a quick pause, thumbs up, thumbs down. I know this session is a bit more theoretical and a little less practical. If it's too confusing, do let me know right now. Is this, or am I what I am saying, is it making sense to all of you? Yes? If it's not making sense, any other emoji, it's fine. I can change it a bit. I can make it a bit easier, a bit more, this thing, example heavy. Cool. I'm going to assume everyone's understanding till now. Second, let's talk about it gives clarity. We talked about this in terms of the example about that motion about hypocrisy and stigma. Starting in, we don't know how important that stigma is within this debate. The adjudicator cannot make any assumptions since they're the average intelligent voter. When that is true, it is your job to explain to the adjudicator what kind of stakes exist within this debate, how important are the things that we're talking about in this debate. If you don't give the clarity, the adjudicator doesn't know why should I care about the specific thing this team is talking about. If your problems are unimportant within the debate, they will be easily weighed out by the other team. This clarity is important because it shows just how important this problem is or how much you should personally care about this problem and the solution that this team is going to give. And therefore, this makes your case much more obvious. This is why you will see rhetorical heavy speakers focus a lot on characterization, because even if their argumentation isn't the strongest, the words that they use make you feel like it's deeply personal and deeply important problem. And that is what characterization and clarity is all about, making you feel that what is being talked about is important and therefore solving it is important. And that is something you can capitalize on. Thirdly, it answers trade-offs, and this will come to more of Rushal's questions in terms of how there are necessarily bad characterizations. Note, every single debate will have trade-offs. There will be something good about your side, there will be something bad about your side. When you're talking about stakeholders, they're incredibly complex. They have multiple incentives. When you're talking about a person or you're talking about a corporation, the primary incentive might be to go ahead and get money, but they might have secondary incentives like having a good public image, like doing a lot of altruism, or going ahead and having a lot of research and development so their future positioning is better. Even in terms of profits, there are short term profits versus long term profits. It could be maximizing your stock right now, or creating market share, or creating the best product right now. All of these things are multiple incentives every single individual stakeholder has. All of them come at a cost to each other. Since you cannot solve all of your problems right now, you go ahead and do multiple things. Think about this in terms of if you have an exam tomorrow, you could either study or you could go ahead and scroll on YouTube shorts. The comparative in this argument is that when you scroll YouTube shorts, you get positive dopamine right now. Maybe that's important to you because you're extremely depressed and you're extremely stressed about the exam and you need something to distract you for the short term. Maybe it's more important for you to go ahead and study for the exam tomorrow morning. Therefore, the trade off necessarily is you'll be much more sadder while you're studying, but you'll continue studying and gaining more knowledge. Therefore, this necessary trade off has to come because your resources and time as a stakeholder are always constrained. Giving obvious clarity on what these trade-offs are for that individual and why they care about one side of the trade-off more than the other side of the trade-off is also characterization, because you're explaining what's important to this person and what is the most important thing relative to the other things that have been spoken about in the debate. Make sense? Thumbs up, thumbs down, questions? Cool. Let's keep moving forward. Characterization and framing. These two go hand in hand, so I want to talk about them once. It's important to note there is no set definition on what characterization is and what framing is. Everyone has their own personal intuition on this, so I'm not asking you to go ahead and change that. But roughly, the way I interpret and what I found most helpful is framing is when talking about what is the most important stakeholder. So you want to ask yourself, for example, do I want to care about these particular set of, like if you're talking about an elections debate at whether the Democratic Party should, for example, move to a much more progressive stance with the rise of people like Zoran Mamdani or AOC becoming much more prominent figures within the Democratic Party. Should they go ahead and have a more progressive stance? You can talk about this in multiple ways. You can talk about A, do they want to go ahead and consolidate the Democratic base? B, do they want to go ahead and like cater more to on the fence voters and centers who don't vote the same way or are not diehard fans of one party every single election? Or C, do you want to go ahead and appease like centric Republicans and try to move them over to your side as opposed to focusing on consolidating your own base? All three of these are trade-offs within the debate. What framing does is talk about which of these stakeholders is the most important one. And therefore, if it is the most important one, this is what the debate should be about. Characterization, on the other hand, is an explanation about these stakeholders. If we talk about on the fence voters who are centric and not particularly leaning Democrat or Republican, what do these people care about? Why are their priorities different from those voters that are Democratic or Republican? And what would do to sway their vote and make them vote for you? The characterization part comes once you've identified an important stakeholder, how you explain their priorities, how you explain their actions, and how you can explain that, for example, what will necessarily convince them to vote for you, how you will explain how their incentives and actions align when they're given the correct push. For example, you can say that because they feel the current Democratic Party in America is too corrupt, and voting, and if they see that much more progressive candidates who run on anti, like who don't take political donors who are billionaires, who run on this anti corruption stance are much stronger than these people, the rest of the Democratic Party does. Maybe that is convincing enough for central voters to go ahead and then vote for the Democratic Party, because their biggest problem with the Democratic Party was they feel that they cater too much to the billionaire or the wealthy class. So here what I've done is I've characterized to you, one, what the incentive of the particular on the fence voters are. Secondly, what will shift them to go ahead and vote for Democratic Party in the first place. And I've given all of this within the context of why therefore government should go ahead and have much more leftist people, how why Democratic Party should have much more leftist people. All of this has done is characterized one particular stakeholder and talked about their incentive and ability. Framing, however, was me talking about why they are the most important stakeholders in terms of maybe they can be the largest base, maybe they can be the ones that are the easiest for you to sway and therefore the easiest to get votes from. All of this is what separates them. Am I making sense? Sarojini, I think this was your question. Has it been answered?
Yeah, it's clear.
Anyone else has any questions till now? Cool. The reason I want to talk about characterization and framing is a fewfold. You'll often see that characterization and framing are always spoken about together, which is to say, you always give characterization and framing at the start of your speech and they come one after another. The reason for this is important. Characterization talks about why the most important stakeholder is necessarily behaving in a particular manner. The problem with this is if you never identified the most important stakeholder, it doesn't matter what stakeholder you're characterizing if you haven't identified that they matter importantly to the debate. Therefore, it's important to frame the important stakeholder and then characterize them. That is idea number one. This is the reason that they go hand in hand. One talks about the importance and one talks about their behavior and ability. The second thing, and why this is important, is they follow similar rules of aggressive characterization that I talk about. You want to go ahead and maximize your speech and provide the clarity about why these people are the ones you should care about, why this is the problem you want to solve, why this is the most important thing within the debate, within the context of framing and characterization. If you're able to pull both of these off well, even if both the teams have similar levels of analysis, just because you're solving the more important and bigger problem within the debate, you'll be able to weigh off your case much better against theirs. Therefore, particularly in strong rooms where everyone is good at explaining how to solve problems, solving the biggest and most important problem is often what wins you the debate. So, framing and characterization helps you identify and answer the biggest problem and solution within the debate, and therefore makes your arguments much, much stronger. Any questions still here? Great. Moving forward. Cool. The most important thing I want you to go ahead and pick up from this lecture is that characterization is argumentation. The way you think about delivering characterization or the parts of characterization need to be in structure very similar to argumentation. What do I mean? A big problem that a lot of debaters face is they assert their characterization. For example, within an argument or a debate about Russia, most people will say Putin is X, Putin is Y, without actually going deeper into why Putin behaves that way. What is that person's incentives? What are the people he is beholden to? What are the like powers that are acting against him or acting for him? All of these are important questions, which, if not answered, just make your characterization assertions. which means another team can rebut them within 5 seconds or just counter assert against you and say, no, this is false. Putin cares about something else. Therefore, it's important for you to strengthen your characterization and make it extremely bulletproof by making it structured like an argument and having a complete sense. Not just saying that, hey, this is the characterization I want to give in the debate, but why this is the correct characterization and why it's an important characterization. We'll go over these things one by one. The first, there are three things I've ended. There are three parts of an argumentation in that go ahead and carry over to characterization. One is analysis. Why is this true? And is this true for everyone? For example, when you talk about social justice movement debates or feminism debates for specific, what does the feminist movement care about? Multiple people will care about multiple things, right? Obviously, the overall goal of providing women an equal stance in society is true. But secondly, if it's a debate about, let's say, feminist motion having multiple incentives and which one should it go ahead and invest in, and we'll take a much more specific example of this later. Why does the feminist movement care about this particular incentive or particular stance or care about accomplishing this particular objective? Why is it aligned with their core objectives? Why is this something that will help them benefit and become more stronger in the future? So therefore, you not only have to prove your characterization exists, why it's true your characterization exists. That's number one. But number two, why is it true for everyone? Which is to say, feminism is a very non-homogeneous social movement, which means it's incredibly intersectional. There are a lot of people in it. All of them have different cultures and different beliefs. Not everyone is going to believe in the same thing about feminism, whether this is good for feminism or whether this is bad for feminism, whether this should be a priority or something else should be a priority, because we have limited amount of resources. Therefore, when you're characterizing, and in order to characterize well, it's important to note not just that something is true, but it's true in the sense that most of the people are aligned with it, or most of the people care about it. Conversely, if you're trying to go ahead and attack something, attack like your opposition in social justice movements, you'll often talk about how there's fracturing within the community if you go ahead and do this. You do this by characterization of how there are different incentives that necessarily exist within the feminist movement. And because these incentives are so diverse, implementing this motion will cause a huge amount of polarity. And within that polarity will lead to resentment and fracturing within the feminist movement, which is a massive harm. You do this by characterizing how it's not true that every single feminist cares about the same characterization or acts along the same characterization. Therefore, whenever you're making an argument and you're talking about big communities and not specific stakeholders, you need to understand one, what their trade offs are, but two, what do they care about the most as a group and as an individual. Does that make sense? Any questions till now? Thumbs up? Cool.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, go on.
A simple question. So when you say a lot of times people go on to assert characterization, right? How do we
Mhm.
get to know the to this extent do we have to explain the characterization that it is not assertion or the judge does not assume that we are asserting something?
Yes. So, similar to argumentation, when you provide analysis, ask yourself the question, have I proved this enough to the extent it is massively obvious? Which is to say, when you're giving an argument, you don't just assert the argument, you give three, four reasonings behind it till it's very clear that what you're talking about has to be correct. It's very similar over here. So, for example, when we talk about Modi, for example, you can talk about what his necessarily who are the kind of people who are like characterization in terms of Modi wants to gather the vote of Hindu nationalists. You can go ahead and then characterize this by talking about how this is their biggest voter base, about how they really care about these particular problems, and therefore if Modi solves these particular problems, he will be able to garner the vote. All of this has made it obvious that Modi's incentive within this debate is to cater to Hindu nationalists. And therefore, because you've given reasoning to make it obvious, that's how you do it. Does that answer your question?
Yep, good.
Sure. If it doesn't answer your question, feel free to follow up. Second, let's talk about the impact. And this is where another reason that a lot of characterizations go wrong. It's not enough to show that you care about XYZ. you have to show that you massively care about XYZ. So, one, you have to talk about why they massively care about it, or it's something that's incredibly important to them. Second, if it's massively important to them, they're willing to do something about it. For example, when we talk about corporations, you can talk about why for corporations it's incredibly important that their image is maintained, that they're seen as good people. Because if corporations are seen as evil, it will hurt their profits and their bottom line, because people would rather buy from a corporation that's seen as less evil because it makes them feel good about themselves as opposed to an evil corporation. Therefore, it is massively in the interest of corporation to look like a good person. They do this by donating to charity. They do this by acting like they're green. They do this by marketing campaigns about how good people they are. All of this means even though these things are expensive, creating your image and your brand and having green initiatives is expensive and hurts your profits, over the long term is incredibly necessary for you to do in order for you to go ahead and be successful. Therefore, what corporations are willing to do is forego short term profits in order to be seen as benevolent, in order to be seen as good people. So, on the long term, they're able to go ahead and get bigger profits. This is the characterization. It's not just that corporations care about long-term profits. It's about necessarily what they're willing to do in status quo in order to protect those long-term profits. What kind of harms are they ready to take right now? What kind of actions are they ready to do that go ahead and achieve their incentives? The converse of this is you also have to talk about the limitations. Uh, like for example, you necessarily want to go ahead and get rich. That is an incentive that you have. For that, you're willing to study hard, you're willing to put in a lot of effort. But that probably means you're not going to go up and stop eating. You're not going to go up and stop having any kind of social life. The problem is because you have limited capacity, even if you want something very dearly, you only have limited ability to do that before it starts infringing on other things, or just because you do only have 24 hours in a day and therefore limited capacity to go ahead and complete something. Therefore, when you're talking about what they're willing to do about it, you also have to talk about what they physically cannot do about it, no matter how much they care about, because there are other things in their lives, or because they have a limitation on resources. A poor person is willing to work very hard in order to go ahead and get money, but he's unable to invest money because he does not have spare income or expendable income. This means no matter how hardworking that poor person is, they're not going to be able to invest in stocks and mutual funds. This is necessarily important characterization because it also shows the limit of your impact and doesn't make it an infinite impact that just says, oh, if you work hard enough, you're going to go ahead and get money. The third thing I want to talk about is comparative. Necessarily, we talked about this in the past, where there are multiple things every individual or every single entity cares about. A stakeholder is not one dimensional, they have multiple differing priorities. You have to show comparatively, if, for example, in a debate, when you show on a comparative why your argument is much more likely to happen on your side than it is to happen on the other side, you have to prove comparatively why you're much more likely to care about this particular thing as an individual than care about the characterization they are talking about. You're much more likely to go ahead and prioritize your health than you are to go ahead and give 0.1% of your net worth. Even if 0.1% of your net worth is obviously something you care about because you as an individual care about money, you still go to the hospital if you can afford it because your health is a bigger priority to you. Same analysis over here. You have to prove in the comparative if both people are claiming some characterizations and some incentives for the stakeholder, why yours are much more important. That's number one. Number two, will this create a tipping point? This is incredibly important, right? A lot of people care about the environment, they think it is important, but very few people act on it. That is to say, you can characterize people care about the environment, but if you're not able to prove they care about the environment to such an extent that they will take active steps in order to reduce their carbon footprint, active steps to hold corporations accountable to ensure that they're not polluting, active steps to donate to green initiatives, it doesn't matter if you can prove that they really care about this, because you haven't proven that they will take action because they care about this. And this will come later in aggressive characterization, because you have to show necessarily it's so important and so urgent to this individual that they can do nothing else but go ahead and care about this. So you have to make it very clear in the comparative where characterization is strong enough that it motivates people in order to take action. Are there any questions? Cool. Let's take a sample motion for comparative, right? I saw a nice motion. Assume there are two kinds of juries. One is an expert jury. These are initially non-lawyers who take a 4-week course on criminal law and take a 20-hour part-time paid job in the court to decide like criminal cases. This is something that is incredibly competitive hiring process. Alternative is normal juries, where you go ahead and are given a mail saying please show up to courtroom XYZ, and you are put on a jury panel and gone ahead and like act like a jury even though you have no actual information of the law. So now this house prefers expert juries to normal juries. Are there any questions? Cool. How do you go ahead?
I have a question. Can you
Yeah,
explain the context for normal juries again? They're
yeah.
just common people, or are they certified in any way?
No, normal juries are randomly selected by mail and then further picked by prosecutor and defense attorney. These juries have no legal knowledge and do not get any teaching on the functioning of the law. They only act as a jury for one case, after which they are dismissed again. They are partially compensated for their time.
Okay.
Cool. Yes, Sarojini.
One question. What is the point of having a jury? Why do we want it?
Um, okay, so that is obviously a good question. It's not very relevant over. Is that, are you saying that's the characterization for this debate? Is this a question you have?
No, I have a doubt regarding this because we did this motion and this was the part that I was really confused about.
Okay, so juries help in determining the guilt of an individual. Why juries are better than judges is something that's completely up for debate. There are multiple reasons why juries might be better than judges. There are multiple reasons why they might be bad. Do you want to dive deeper into it? What's your specific question?
As in, I wanted to ask, why do we want these set of people who know very little about the law to decide anything in a courtroom where you have attorneys who know a good amount of stuff and even the judge?
Cool. Okay. So normally, why companies hire juries is or preferences. When you have a jury of 10 people, for example, their biases sort of cancel out and you're able to come to a much more non-biased decision due to the power of numbers. That's one of the reasons why juries are seen as important. This also thinks about representation and all, but I won't go deeper there. Yes, Rochelle.
So in this framing, do jury is the decision of the jury final, or can a judge overrule them?
No, jury decisions are always final. Do you, yeah, anything else? Cool. So the first clash in this debate, like Sarojini points out, is where good decisions are necessarily made, right? Which is to say, where are you going to have better decisions made that are accurate and representative of law and humanity culture? How can we then go ahead and characterize normal juries? Can someone give me an example over here and try to be comparative? Anyone? Let's go with expert juries first. Why would expert juries care about being correct?
I think having gone through 20 hours of law school, or the pre-intern and then 4 weeks of law school or whatever, due to this having some knowledge of the law and how it works and how prosecutions work, people would be incentivized to make better decisions because they have more information that is accurate or relevant to the case.
Okay, so you're saying the quality of decisions is better because they have been informed by the law. What else?
As by the context, the competition for expert juries is high, which means to be a part of that jury, you have to be extremely accurate. Therefore, you want to prove yourself as the best rational person in the court.
Excellent. This is an important part of this, right? In order to get a good, like a good jury that is able to deliver an accurate results, there are two things. One, they have fundamental knowledge and understanding of the law. The second thing is they're actually caring and listening. You could be extremely smart and know everything about the law, but if you don't care about the case, if you don't put in the effort to listen, it won't matter. Your results will not be as accurate. Same thing over here because these as Pragun highlights, because these people are extremely competitive because they want to get hired for the next jury selection, they go ahead and then go pay attention much more because they need to go ahead and make this because if they don't make an accurate um, decision, then they are going to not go ahead and get selected next time. This gives clear incentive. So, one, we talked about why in characterization, why these people care about something, but not just why they care about it, why it is extremely important to them because their livelihood depends on this. But secondly, also, they do care about this enough to actually pay attention. That is, if you're a normal, if a random like jury goes ahead and has all lawyers, they still might not care enough because they're not being compensated for it enough or because it doesn't affect their future compensation. Therefore, even if they're equally smart on both sides, it doesn't matter because what's important is not smartness, it's about how much attention you're willing to pay. And this is the comparative and tipping point I talked about. The tipping point comes from the incentive that the next paycheck is dependent on how you perform as a jury and not just going ahead and being someone who is smart. Does that make sense? Is everyone clear on comparative and tipping points in characterization? Anyone else? Questions, thumbs ups? Cool. Let's keep moving forward then.
Before we move forward for this motion, can you give us a few examples on how we can defend lay juries? And
Uh,
why is this motion specifically made for criminal cases only? What's that about? Like,
Cool. This is slightly outside the ambit of this discussion, so I won't spend too much time on it. But the way lay juries work is that sometimes not having any law information is crucial because law information provides biases towards your decision making. For example, the necessary law information will still be told to you before the case. Number one. Number two, prosecutors and this thing defend the defense attorney have incentives to educate you about the law during the course of the trial wherever they think it's relevant and important. So you're taught enough about the law to care about it. But two, because you don't have these biases found because of the law, your decision is much more representative of what the normal person thinks. And then you can argue why the normal person thinking is a better decision making thing than just having it be by the book of law. Because some laws are incredibly bad. For example, you can look up something called a hung jury, HUNG jury, and there is argumentation on why people should necessarily care about more, like what is morally correct is what people think in general, as opposed to what the law dictates. And therefore, what should a criminal code be about? There's a lot of stuff which is not about characterization. This is a very difficult and complex motion. So, yeah, I'm just going to skip over it from now. Is that okay? Cool.
I have
Let's go
a
about. Yeah, go
I
on.
have Yeah, regarding so if the side defending expert jury says that the normal juries are likely to be bought out or corrupted because they're just common people, whereas the expert juries, having been in this industry for a long time, know correct defense metrics or have enough protection, whereas normal people can be easily threatened or given it's a criminal case motion. How can I defend that if I am a nor if I'm the side defending the normal jury?
So there are ways to answer it, but I'd like to answer it from the terms of characterization, right? Go ahead and then talk to me about what a normal juror who's randomly selected cares about. What are their incentives?
Um, okay, they want to be a good moral person, they want to be right, but
Sure.
but the,
What's
the threat of life still comes at a bigger stake, right? So if the criminals or is the case about to happen, and the people on the guilty side is threatening the judge to make a biased decision, that is from a normal jury. How is that? Uh,
Okay, then talk about an expert jury. What are the incentives of an expert jury? Is it to give the correct decision or is it to not die?
yeah, but like the way to approach defense for having more contacts is still better, marginally better on expert jury, right? He knows
Yes,
more lawyers, he knows more policemen.
sure, but it doesn't matter if you're convinced that you're going to die. See, that's how characterization works, right? If I'm able to characterize that you are scared of the mobster who's going to go ahead and murder you if you don't decide in a particular way, it doesn't matter how much access to security you have, how many contacts you have, because the value you place on your life and the small percentage of chance you'll still be killed because you believe this mobster is incredibly powerful that despite security they might get to you, or even if there's only a 5% chance of you dying, the priority you have over your life is much more than the priority you have over making the correct decision. If that is true, it doesn't matter what the like it doesn't matter because the person will always vote in the way the mobster tells them, because through characterization the importance that they place in their life drives them to action in choosing the wrong verdict as opposed to the morality idea of behaving in a good way. Does
Oh
that
yeah,
make sense?
that answers the question. Thank you.
Right, this is like you can even argue that random juries also have access to this information, because when they become select as jurors they are told all of this stuff, that if someone threatens or intimidates you, you can reach out to these people and get the security. So this whole argument can be symmetricized on both sides. But even if you're looking at from a characterization perspective, how you can prove this is non-comparative, is show that this person cares much more about their life than they care about the correct decision on both sides of the house. This is true for expert juries, this is true for random juries. Therefore, both of them are likely to behave in the same manner because their incentives are aligned. Um, sure. Let's go to rebutting characterization. There are three things over here. Like I talked about in the previous slide, every characterization is an argument. It has three parts. You rebut arguments on their analysis, on their impact, on the comparative. Similarly, you have when you're going ahead and rebutting characterization, you want to do it in these three ways. One, analysis. The characterization that they have given and the incentives that they have given within this debate, does it really matter to the stakeholder? Is it something that's really important to them? If the answer is no, you can take out the characterization by proving that the assumption under which the characterization lies or the analysis made for this characterization is incorrect. Second, impact. Are they going to change something to get what they want? Do they have the ability to change something what they want? This comes to my previous idea and the environmentalism. Everyone cares about the environment, but nobody cares about it enough to go ahead and make changes in their lifestyle to reflect environment. For example, veganism is something that is excellent for the environment because poultry releases so much like toxic gases within the environment. Even though people care about environment, very few people go ahead and become vegan because of the environment. Therefore, the if you're able to prove that the impact won't happen because this person does, even though they care about this thing, doesn't care enough to go ahead and take actions that the other team is talking about, you can rebut them at the characterization level by showing that this is something that's not important. Second, on the thing of do they have the ability, this is also important. Take the veganism example. Veganism is also incredibly expensive because the kind of food is one, much harder to get, two, slightly lesser produced. Meat is something that's available in mass quantity in most places, or three, just harder to obtain in certain climates. Therefore, it's expensive to go ahead and be vegan. So it doesn't matter if I care about the environment enough to go vegan. I just don't have the money to afford vegan food. And therefore, there is, even though there's incentive, there's not capability to go ahead and create this action. So if government argues in favor of veganism by proving, characterizing people as being environmentally good people, you can take that down not by arguing that they're not environmentally conscious people, but just the fact that even though they are environmentally conscious, they don't take enough steps or they don't have the ability to take the steps in order to go ahead and become vegan. That is how you go ahead and rebut something on characterization. The third thing is comparative. Is the characterization they have given exclusive to their stakeholder or their side? This is something Pragun and I talk about, right? Necessarily because people always value their lives more than they value the moral decision of a single criminal case outcome. they're always going to go ahead and listen to that particular mobster and behave in the manner that has been quote unquote requested of them. So this is uncomparative or inexclusive to both sides because the incentives are the same and therefore the characterization on both sides is the same. So this is not a unique argumentation that can only be run on government because opposition and government are going to react in the same manner because of the same characterization. Second, you talk about in terms of importance. We talked about this before. There are multiple competing priorities for every single individual. Is this particular priority something that's much more important than the priority you have given? If you're able to suppose, for example, in a normal debate, how you weigh out argumentation by talking about how their argument is not important, our argument is much more important. Similarly, you do this in characterization when you say that our characterization is much more important, our incentives are much more important to the stakeholder than how they have characterized the same stakeholder. Therefore, they're much more likely to behave in the manner that we have told you than in the manner they have told you. Does this make sense? Are there any questions on rebutting characterization?
Uh, I'm a question more about like the mobster case. So you said, right? So this metricization you show works when it's a threat to life, right? What if it's a financial incentive? Because then you could argue that a lay jury, like a normal jury, might be more willing to accept bribes, whereas an expert jury might not because it threatens their career. So, like, what if it's a characterization like that? How do you really counter that?
You can counter that by showing that if you're caught being corrupt as a juror, you go to jail, and therefore character you have to then weigh off the characterization about how much people care about going to jail as opposed to how much they care about financial incentives. So then you have to talk about what's more proximate to an individual, what they think is a bigger harm, how likely they think they're going to go to jail. All of these questions then come. So then you have a like clash on characterization by talking about what is the most important thing to this person.
All right, thank you.
Sure. Anyone else has any other questions? I'm assuming no. Let's go into the final part. Aggressive characterization. So there are three ways to make your characterization aggressive. We talked about why characterization is important because it scales the extent of the impact that is necessarily present within the debate. It makes your argument much more immediate, much more important, and much more therefore like the solution being the much more critical thing and winning thing therefore within the debate. The way you go ahead and do this when you're giving your speech is making these characterization answer three questions. One, why is it the most important thing to the stakeholder, independent of everything else that is important to the stakeholder? Second, why they're willing to go ahead and do a lot in order to go ahead and achieve this incentive, and not just like a random incentive that they care about but won't change their lives much for. Third, why this is the most obvious thing within the debate and why it's so natural and obvious to the stakeholder to perform in such a manner that nothing else really matters within this debate, that any external circumstance or any external characterization does not matter because it's obvious that they're going to behave in this manner and no other manner. Let's go over this one by one. Why, like, how can we go ahead and make it the much most important thing to stakeholders? Motion, this house is South Korea, would aim to significantly increase its cross border economic cooperation with North Korea. Let's talk about this from government's perspective. Um, this is an economics debate. We all know this. The most important stakeholders are obviously both the Koreas. What are the economic, like, how would you characterize South Korea economically? Note, because you're trying to prove that it's incredibly important to South Korea to go ahead and have better economic relationships with North Korea. That means there is a problem in South Korea's economy that needs to be solved that can uniquely only be solved through North Korea. So, how would you go ahead and then characterize South Korea within this debate? Anyone? What do we know about South Korea?
I have one, and this is based off I know nothing about South Korea. That since you told this is an economic problem, every country needs some kind of imports through other regions, right? North Korea, being sharing the border, has the least amount of transport expenses, which may be
Ex-
covered through like importing from US or somewhere, which makes the cost more. That's why it's cheaper for South Korea to approach North Korea.
Excellent. That's a really good idea, but there's one problem with it. Can someone tell me why is importing from North Korea a problem?
So are
Their
we
domestic
importing
industry is not
from
that
North
strong.
Korea or to North Korea?
No, just North Korea exporting to South Korea. Why is that a problem?
North Korea being a bad
North
actor.
Korean industry isn't that good, so like they don't have enough capacity to export further from their borders currently.
Excellent. Because of the way that the North Korea has isolated itself from rest of society, they're just not very technologically capable. Therefore, they're not able to produce goods at the same capacity level and profit margins, and therefore they will not be able to export. So, Pragun, excellent idea on why it's cheaper to have North Korea so close by, but importing isn't the right idea. Can you, any of you, give me another idea on the idea of cheapness?
Employment.
Excellent. Labor. So you can get labor.
Labor.
Yep, you can get laborers from North Korea. That is excellent. That is going to be our first argumentation why labor is cheap from North Korea, and therefore South Korea can build better factories for its people that are able to produce more goods because labor becomes slightly more accessible. In order to, like, this is a problem we're solving. In order to do that, we have to talk about this being an incredibly important problem to South Korea, which is what characterization is about. Can someone tell me why labor is going to be a massive problem for South Korea in the future?
Birth rates.
Yes, excellent. What else? Just tied to birth rates. One more thing. Cool. Necessarily, South Korea right now, one has declining birth rates. People aren't having babies because of the stress that necessarily exists within that society, because of the kind of economic like situation that they necessarily are in, which means developed countries are less likely to have more babies. Developing countries usually have more babies, and therefore there's something called value over replacement, which is to say for every two people dying, you ideally want two babies in order to have a sustained population. But in South Korea, lesser people are having babies. The fertility rate in South Korea is something that's incredibly low because of a lot of things, including like just natural stresses and stuff. Like Japan, South Korea, and all of these people places are incredibly toxic work culture places, and therefore it's incredibly demanding on you, and therefore you're incredibly stressed out to have relationships and stuff. There was a recent movement in South Korea where women swore not to date, not to have sex, or not to have babies, etc., etc., which means there's like a social cultural impact in terms of just not having more children. All of this means mm, South Korea is not producing a lot of babies. What this means in 20 years is there's not going to be enough working population, but there are going to be a shit ton of old people who cannot produce for the economy. So your demands are high because old people need a lot of healthcare costs, need pensions and retirements, need some sort of income in order to like justify their existence. But this will not exist because South Korea, because they're not having enough babies right now, will not have an enough strong enough working population within 20 years. This means they need to replace those laborers in some other way. If they're able to go ahead and have excellent cross-border economic cooperation, they'll be able to source their labor from North Korea, which is not having these same problems because North Korea is quote unquote a developing country and therefore has an excess of birth rates and an excess of labor. So you will be able to get this labor for much cheaper than you would be able to if you got it anywhere else. What we've done is we've characterized South Korea as having an economic problem in 20 years of not having enough laborers, and then we've created a solution of North Korea having enough laborers, and thus good economic cooperation will lead to this problem being fixed. If I hadn't characterized, if I hadn't talked about why South Korea's problem is so important, because we can talk about how if there's not enough laborers and too many old people, I've talked about how expensive it is. Your economy will collapse. You will not be able to generate stuff, so you'll not be able to export and buy stuff either. All of this means our characterization proved this is a core central economic problem South Korea has, and the only solution is to go ahead and therefore because it's so important, even if your political ties with North Korea are bad, this solution will solve your bigger economic problem. If I just said that South Korea gets more laborers and that's my argument, it wouldn't have gotten very far because the impact of that is minimal. But powerful characterization by showing why it's a central problem to South Korea made my argument a lot more powerful. Does that make sense to all of you? Thumbs up, thumbs down, any questions? Cool. Second one, let's talk about this. We've already talked about why we need to show it is a really, really important problem for a stakeholder to be having, and that's why we're solving it, and that's why you can weigh it off. Second thing is show that they're willing to do a lot for it. This house opposes the pressure to focus on promoting one's career at the expense of forming a family. Let's talk about this one. Why are people so? I'll explain it a bit. The pressure is necessarily a narrative. There exists a narrative that you need to promote your own career and you need to have a great career. Even if it comes at the expense of having a family, you're going to have it's even if you don't have a family or you have it very late or you don't prioritize them in your daily life, it's much more important for you to go ahead and have a career. The argument government is going to give is that this is extremely toxic and harmful, and your emotional health and well-being is going to get worse. This argumentation only works if you characterize it in a manner that people will believe this narrative to such an extent that they will forget about their family completely or not prioritize their family despite them knowing that family is important. How do you go ahead and give this characterization?
You need money to provide for your family so that they can do good things. And the way that you can get money is through a career.
Sorry, I didn't understand.
You need money to provide for your family to give them better opportunities. And the way that you can get money is if you have the best career and the best job.
Yes, sure. That is definitely true. Let me rephrase the question. I want to prove that people, because of this narrative, are prioritizing their career to such a large extent, it is damaging their well being. If that is my argument, how can I characterize this narrative to show that it is so prevalent and so harmful?
Can we talk about how the outcomes or growth in a career is much more tangible and immediate, and you can recognize it more? Like you can see your paycheck every month, right? So you having that direct feedback loop to yourself makes you much more susceptible to being more emotionally vulnerable about it or getting worked up about it.
Sure. Makes sense, yes. The problem is it exists independent of the narrative, which is to say, even if this narrative doesn't exist, people are still going to go ahead and focus on career if people care about immediate rewards. So, your argument is correct in terms of how this narrative is strengthened by the idea that it is much more easier to prove than alternate narratives. But it's also true that even in the absence of this narrative, people care about immediate rewards. So, it's not the most powerful argument here.
I have one.
Go on.
Since you want, since promotion is given when you are highly productive, therefore people prioritize their early or energetic years, that is like till 30s or 40s, to their career because they can delay having a family, but they can't have delay productivity in a older age. So that's why they keep career at a first priority over family.
Excellent. Pravan, excellent, excellent. Let's go a step back. When is it taught to you to prioritize your career or your career is important?
When you are more productive or when you're more energetic in young age.
Oh, what is young age? Define young age.
um, 20s to 35, 40s.
Are you told that your career is important in your 20s for the first time?
No, it's told from the beginning. Okay, elementary education till,
Yes. And that is important because
because those are the formative years of life and it creates a huge impact till
ex-
the later years.
excellent. Does someone else want to complete this argument? Anyone else? Cool.
Is it
This
related
idea
to
is really
social conditioning?
yeah, social conditioning, exactly. Necessarily, you're taught to prioritize your career and told that your career is important right from the beginning, which is to say, you're not told to prioritize family when you're 10 years old or 15 years old, but you're told to prioritize your career right from the beginning. This means ever since your formative years, ever since you started like thinking about stuff, you have been told to prioritize your career. You've been told that you need to maximize your career. That narrative already exists, right? The point at which you then tell them, that means that people, because they think career is so important to them, they go ahead and do a lot for their career in the first place. The point at which you add this narrative on top of that, that you need to go ahead and like your family is not important to you, you prioritize your career because of the existing work, because of the existing narratives, because of this narrative adding on to the previous narrative, you go ahead and discard your family. You bury yourself in work because most narratives around you have already told you to bury yourself inside work. Therefore, you forego having a family. You do a lot to fulfill the narrative because the narrative is so strong, because there are multiple narratives surrounding it, because it compounds with the narratives that were given to you when you were a child. All of this particularly means you're focusing on your career is so high because the narratives to fulfill it are so high, you are going to go ahead and let go of your emotional well being, let go of your family because you only care about this. So, what we've shown through characterization of the narratives about how this narrative is is told to you from an early age onwards and how it significantly impacts your way of processing life, people will do a lot. People will prioritize their work a lot more over their family. We've shown that the comparative in this debate is massive, and therefore the problem in this debate is massive because of the way that the narrative is characterized. Is this making sense? Are there any questions till now? Cool, let's move forward. Third, make it seem like the most obvious thing. When you're characterizing something, it's not enough to just factually speak about it. You also have to make it sound like it's the most obvious thing. I talked about this before, where rhetorical speakers will focus a lot on characterization. Just make it sound like naturally it's the most important thing to individuals. Pragman, yeah?
Yeah, sorry, I had it out. Coming back to the previous point of willingness, the initial point I spoke about that productivity is lowered when you grow older, but like you can have family later as well, because that's not something related to your muscle growth or something. Uh, any points that should I add to make it much more impactful? Or first, is it
Again,
even a valid characterization in the first place?
afterwards is not characterization related.
No, any points of characterization that can make it like much more convincing?
Um, mm, just repeat the question once. About how family can come later, right? That's fine. So necessarily then you can talk from proposition's point of view, you can talk about how this narrative progresses in a way that you always think family can come later. When you're in your mid 20s, you can think family come later. When you're in your mid 30s, you can think your family can come later. So the idea of family coming later, because it has no defined objective, always is something that you internalize as something come later because you think you're running out of time in your career. Therefore, it becomes much more harmful, and you're not able to generate a family at any point of time because you keep delaying the consequences of having a family. That is one way you can characterize it. Make sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, so I had a doubt that in most of the narrative motions, the way that Gov can progress forward in their characterization is by proving that the stakeholders are like so willing to join into this narrative, but also this narrative is the most proximate thing to them, right? So, what's a way to prove that this narrative is something that is like, if he doesn't opt into this narrative, probably it would be so bad for him. So, like, how can we prove this narrative is the most proximate thing for a person, like in general?
You can talk about this in terms of social conditioning that we talked about, right? Ever since you're a kid, because your parents tell you to do something, and if you actively oppose that narrative or you act against that narrative, your parents won't be happy with you. And as a kid, your parents approving of you is probably the most important thing. You socially isolate yourself, the point at which you reject the narratives that are present in the community around you. You're seen as a bad individual. That means people are less likely to be friends with you. People are less likely to be around you. This leads to social isolation, which has negative effects on your work, on your mental health, and so much more. That is how you argue, why rejecting a narrative is bad.
Cool. Thank you
Cool.
so much.
Sure. Let's move to the last thing. Make it seem like it's the most obvious thing within the debate. Whereas it's not enough to say it's important. Talk about how it's natural. It's a natural evolution and the natural thing that they will do. So, for example, if you talk about an incentive and you say this is the action they're going to take to fulfill that incentive, why is this the particular action? Why would they not fulfill that incentive in a different way? So, for example, back to our environmentalism, why would you fulfill your environmentalism by donating to a green initiative? Why would you not do it just by cutting out paper straws and other things? which actions are you likely to take, which actions are you not likely to take. The way to answer this question while delivering a characterization is by talking about how this is the most obvious solution for the problem, and therefore the one that people take because it is the path of least resistance. Let's look at the motion, right? This house believes that India should prioritize policies that aim to significantly reduce economic inequality rather than prioritize policies that aim to rapidly drive economic growth. Any questions till now? Everyone's clear on the motion?
Um, is it like Indian government or the party that is ruling Indian government?
Yes. Mhm.
Is the party?
Yes, it is the party, but technically it doesn't matter because this house believes India should do something. So normally you do talk about the party in power when you talk about India should do something, but think about it holistically. What will the people of India do? Let's start with this. Let's look at the Gov argument, right? Reduce economic inequality rather than prioritize policies that aim to drive economic growth. Why would you want to prioritize economic inequality? Let Can someone give me an argumentation?
Reducing inequality or like creating equity could bring more people into the workforce as productive members of society, and it would basically spread employment across multiple fields.
Sure, excellent. And now, how can you characterize that as a problem?
Um, if there is no equality, people who do not get their share of income are likely to protest against the government and cause chaos. I know a lot of links that if I go on explaining it takes too much time, but you can drive it up to chaos and protest.
Hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent argument. Let's go over it once. Let's say there's a lot of political instability, political, religious, etc., instability inside India, which is caused by economic inequality. How can you go ahead and characterize this argument? So the way you go ahead and do this is talk about it as the biggest problem, right? How can we talk about political instability being the most important problem in India?
Uh, India is a diverse nation in the first place, which means different communities with different ideologies are already clashing. Income
Hmm.
inequality gives them another reason to oppress over each other or fight each other.
Hmm. What else?
Can we say India's income disparity is intrinsically tied to a lot of its classist or maybe like casteist systems?
Sure, I'm not sure how it will impact the debate.
No, so in the sense like preservation of wealth by like the upper caste or hoarding of wealth has created political disputes or like hatred within factions of communities.
Excellent, yes, sure. Though how the economic inequality has led to a level of polarization that necessarily exists because the rich people obviously want economically conservative policies, whereas the poor people want economically progressive policies. And therefore, this high level of polarization leads to a lot of anger and vitriol. That's one way to talk about it. The general thing we want to talk about is why this is a big problem. We can talk about it in terms of India's economic problems are not that massive. They have decent GDP growth. They have decent economic stability, relatively speaking. They're not in a recession. They have decent growth, right? The bigger problem with India is that they not have political stability, which leads to a lot of violence and unnecessary deaths. This also leads to problems within international relations because they're seen as a quote unquote third world country or a developing country because of the level of violence that necessarily happens, because of the level of poverty that necessarily takes place. Therefore, if the biggest problem in India is not its production, but gaining control over the world in terms of having better international relations, in terms of establishing it as a superpower, and that's the most important thing that can only happen when India is seen as a nation that is not riddled with poverty. That will only happen if you actively have policies to reduce economic inequality. I'm taking 200 gaps here, I know, but the general idea is you identify a biggest problem that is there in India through characterization. You talk about how they want to legitimize themselves as a global superpower, and that is the most central important thing to a lot of people. If that is true, then the question becomes how do you go ahead and legitimize yourself? That shows that because your perception of other people is this way, reversing that perception is the only way in order to go ahead and then legitimize yourself. That reversal of perception can only happen by solving economic inequality. Therefore, I just don't talk about solving economic inequality is good. I talk about it in perspective of how it leads to larger impacts and benefits in terms of solidifying India as a global superpower, which will give it economic benefits, which will drive more investment, which will make the lives of people much more better, right? This thing I've done here is I've made it obvious. I've made it obvious that if India wants to achieve the global superpower status, they need to reduce economic inequality, and this is the easiest way for them to be perceived as a superpower. Once they're able to achieve that goal, they're able to achieve all of the problems that are solving this. I identified a bigger problem in my characterization and showed that the solution to that problem is the one that I'm talking about within the motion. And therefore, my characterization maximizes my impact because I'm solving a much bigger problem in my characterization. Is this making sense? This was a little roundabout. Are there questions? We can take another motion if you like. I'm going to assume you're all geniuses and have no questions.
Uh,
Cool.
One more regarding
Yes.
India's priority being the superpower. Uh,
Hmm.
why if I get your idea, but if the op raises question, why is economic growth not a concern while becoming a superpower?
I talked about this, right? India has decent economic growth already. The
Okay.
reason for this is that there is a massive lower middle class that is willing to take up cheap jobs, which is like things like Swiggy, Zomato, etc. drivers you see that are not incredibly high paid laborers, but are necessary laborers in order to sustain the economy. So you have a lot of cheap labor, you have a lot of material goods because India has a lot of resources because of its geographical
Okay, yeah.
location.
Yeah, by the no, so essentially it is like if it were not to be in India or some other developing country, which and you have to make one choice between these two, and it's not given that we empirically know that India has a high economic growth, but it's a country that does not have a high economic growth, and you
Mhm.
want to run the same argument. Uh,
Then you need to actively change your characterization to show what the problem in this debate is, right? You can talk about it in terms of what kind of problems they have. Do they have political instability problems? Do they have certain problems? For example, you can talk about how people are dying. Like your labor force is not sustainable right now because so many people are dying in poverty, or poverty is a cause of like widespread disease and stuff, or like a lack of tourism because people don't want to go to places that are surrounded by homeless people. If you're able to solve the inequality problem there and these people are better housed, they're able to participate in the labor force, you get more tourism. This leads to much more economic activity. So it really depends on how the country is and how you characterize it.
okay, what?
Any other questions? Cool. Moving forward. Again, I just want to go back and give the recap since we're almost done. When we're looking at characterization, we need to again go back and ask ourselves a question. Should I give the characterization? Is there value in giving this characterization? In our previous ones over here, we in the previous motions I talked about, there was value in giving a characterization since we were able to highlight the most important problem through characterization and therefore solve the most important problem through characterization. That is why we gave it. If we weren't identifying good problems, if we were just talking about, oh, India is a country that's struggling, that's not good enough characterization because it didn't make my debate argument better. If it made my argument better by solving problems, then I should give that characterization. How do I give that specific characterization? We talked about this in the South Korea one. How about how their economy exists right now? What is going to look like in the future, and therefore what is the problem they're going to face, and why the only solution therefore becomes labor from North Korea. All of this tied it together by making it persuasive because I was able to logically show through analysis, through impact, through comparative that this is convincing enough, that this is the only logical reasoning why you should go ahead and have this. Therefore, we just didn't assert characterization. We took logical steps in order to prove that the characterization is true. And therefore, it is also advancing my argumentation since it is presenting a problem that I'm going to solve within my arguments. These are the ways you go ahead and think about characterization from the beginning. And yeah, that's practically everything. Thank you guys so much. Thanks for listening. Just a couple of things before I end it. One, thank you to SMVIT for having me. Please do, but I mean, most of you are competing within their competition next week. Those of you who haven't signed up, please do. The second thing is there are a lot of other excellent workshops that necessarily exist on characterization and framing. A few that I personally took, like I wouldn't say I copied, but I necessarily took a lot of inspiration from and that helped me become a better debater are one by Manchester Debating Union on YouTube, this one by Tim Pulisic that is present on Digital Matter Files. Rumen on his channel has also posted one on characterization. All of these are also incredibly helpful in order to understand characterization and dive deeper into some aspects that I haven't like dove deeper into. So if you want to go ahead and learn more, please do go there. Those are incredibly good resources. And that's everything from me. Thank you. Are there any questions? I'll be around for 5-10 minutes if you guys have any questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I sent this earlier today. So I was doing East India pre-worlds, and basically I had a motion on how society should prefer modern contextualized based reinterpretations of religious texts over fundamentalist interpretations, right? So basically sticking to the books as they were. So how do you really characterize religious institutions like the Catholic
You're breaking a lot, but
Church,
you're breaking a lot, but I understood
mosques
the.
across the world, um, uh, the Jewish, I'm forgetting what they call mandirs, etc., etc. Can I type it in chat?
It's okay. I heard you. You were just breaking a lot,
All
but
right, you got it. Okay, cool.
yeah, necessarily then. One, just I want to point to something. First, you can do framing and characterization and talk about what's more important in this motion. Is institutions more important? Are the people more important? Are non-believers more important? Let's assume you have already done that and framed religious institutions as the most important thing within the debate. Within that, the way you want to characterize that is by talking about what necessarily they care about. What are the incentives of religious institutions, right? One, they want to maximize the number of people that they necessarily have because they believe that taking more people into their religion is the way that they get into heaven. Second, they want to expand their influence within the people that they already are that are part of the religion, which is to say that if necessarily um, you want someone else to go to heaven, they need to perform acts that are ones that will take them to heaven. So in Islam, this looks like making sure that they don't do haram stuff and making sure that they're behaving like they're doing stuff that is good in their religion necessarily. Then how, because religious institutions care about one, maximizing the number of people, two, maximizing the amount of influence they have on the people that are in their religion, how should religions then behave? You can go ahead and characterize this for gov or op. You can talk about how most people, because of social influences, have become extremely modern and progressive compared to religions. Therefore, the only way for religions to go ahead and get these people or keep them convinced to stay is to have more modern reinterpretations of existing religious texts, because otherwise they will not be able to go ahead and cater to these people because their fundamental values are different from the fundamental values of the religion. That is how you can go ahead and do this. Or conversely, you can talk about how religious institutions only care about people who are extremely religious because they don't care about maximizing the number of people. They only want few people, but those they genuinely believe are highly tied into like their religion, because these are the people who are likely to donate more. These are the people who are likely to perform religious activities more. Most people don't do this and therefore are not making their religion better. You only want hardcore religious people. For them, maybe you don't want to be shown as progressive because makes you seem like a hypocrite because you are not changing your interpretation from the ones that they grew up on, and this makes them angry because their values are not aligned. So you talk about what the incentive of the religious institution is, what kind of people is their incentive, and then in order to appease that incentive, what they're willing to do and how they're going to act. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so basically what kind of happened is both teams kind of characterize it in like the way you just described, but like didn't really engage with each other, so it kind of went in parallel. So at that point, do you just treat it as an impasse and then move on and then weigh your other arguments?
No, so you have to not be parallel. So necessarily you have
No,
to engage.
of course, but like yeah.
Yeah, so necessarily what we talked about in terms of rebutting their characterization, right? That's what you need to do. Parallel things happen when team A talks about something being important to stakeholder, and uh, team B talks about something else being important to stakeholder. The problem there is that you're not rebutting, which is you have to say, sure, both things are important, but this is more important than what the other team is talking about, and therefore this is much more important thing in the debate, and then it doesn't become parallel because you're rebutting their claims actively. So if it both teams are becoming parallel, you have to go ahead and then step in and try to prove that your thing, your characterization is much more important, relevant to the religious institution than the other one.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions? I have missed a few motions, largely because they're too long and I couldn't include them in the workshop. If you have questions, we can still go over them. Does anyone have any questions? Otherwise, we can all go back to our real lives.
Just one more short question.
Yeah, tell me.
As closing, is contradicting your opposition's characterization necessarily knifing if it can be justified in a certain way?
I mean, wait, the assumption there is knifing is bad. You can knife legitimately. So, contradicting the characterization at opening is knifing, sure. But if you can justify the knife, it's perfectly reasonable to do within a debate. So,
All right,
that's okay. You
thank
don't
you.
have to treat knifing as a bad thing. But secondarily, you don't have to actively contradict as well. You can just go ahead and try to prove why your characterization is something that's more important than the characterization they're talking about, or something another like basically you show that they have another priority and that priority is actively fulfilled this way. So you say opening has under mechanized their analysis and we provide better characterization through better analysis. You don't have to say that they're contradicted by saying their characterization is wrong and we're taking the opposite stance.
In
Does
debates
that
where
answer your question? Go on.
in debates where you need to prove something like principally matters more than any kind of direct economic impacts or whatever, like how do you make your principal argument stronger through characterization?
Um, so principal arguments necessarily do not rely on characterization usually because the point of principal argumentation is that in irrespective of what the impact or the irrespective of what the characterization is, everyone should behave in a particular manner. That is, for example, we say that doing some things are morally abhorrent no matter what the use case, like why that is happening. If that you can prove that, it shouldn't matter what the characterization is. So characterization is often not used in um, this thing principled argumentation.
No, if it's like for a specific actor.
Can you give me an example?
uh,
So if you're talking about a character should do something that is principally justified, you have to necessarily characterize why they are a principal actor. So you want to talk about why they're a morally good person and they care about behaving in a moral manner. And therefore, if you're able to prove that, your impact gets strengthened on principles because they believe that's a correct thing to do. If they don't believe in morally good things or morally rational things, then your principal argument doesn't stand because that's something that's not important to the actor.
this house as a journalist would like release the Mein Kampf like second part.
Yeah, exactly. Here, so whenever you're doing actor motions, it's important to prove why that actor is one that is principally good. If you don't do that, you cannot run principled argumentation because if the actor is not principally moral, then it doesn't matter if you tell them to do a moral act, or it gives them no value. Principles only have a moral if the actor performing them believes that they have a moral value. Make sense? So that's the first half to answer your question. The second half on how you can justify some individual as moral, you can talk about why societal conditioning always tells you to go ahead and be moral, that you always are told as a person to behave in a moral manner because it is the best manner to behave in. The second thing you can talk about is necessarily how humans have genetical bias for behaving in a moral manner, in terms of how you will see that humans always, like, for example, if you see monkeys in a tested environment, they're always going ahead and sharing. Even though there's no incentive for you to go ahead and share, you just have a bias to perform in a like a manner that's morally correct. Similarly, humans also replicate this behavior, and therefore people, just by the fact of existing, believe that there is some reason to be moral and therefore behave in a moral manner. So you can talk about societal conditioning, you can talk about all these things. Then you have to talk about comparatively why this is more important than other incentives. You have an incentive to be greedy, to be selfish, to maximize your personal gain. You have to talk about why behaving morally is something that's much more important to this person than it is to be greedy and selfish.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? They don't have to be related to characterization. Any debate questions? Cool. If not, thank you so much. Goodbye, everyone. Bye bye.